So we have had Rabbi Yaffe in Atlanta join us a few times. It's been a few years, so I think we need to do this again in person. That's what I'm thinking.
At least a decade.
Sorry?
At least a decade.
Yeah, Rabbi Yaffe once spoke on the topic, and this is, Rabbi, I quote you often on this because I love speaking about this topic. You spoke about dreams and premonitions. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. I mean, it would be ironic if you don't remember about the dreams and premonitions, but anyway, so it was just a phenomenal talk. And I quote you often with some of the insights that you shared then about how when we sleep, the soul, the neshama kind of rises up from the body and is able to see things, peer out and observe things. So I'm a big fan of Rabbi Yaffe. Tonight's topic is, I think, incredible. And that is the only bad question is the one that's not asked. So there's a lot to think about in that topic. And I'll ask Rabbi Yaffe also maybe to share at any point, either the beginning, at the end, or the middle, some reflections on maybe the time that we're in. You know, we're all kind of in this strange times with you just think life is complicated and different and many challenges and also many opportunities, but maybe perhaps Rabbi Yaffe, if you could share some insights into that as well. So without too much further ado, I think pretty much I'm looking to see here. Yeah, everyone is in so far as those that have attempted to get in. So I want to welcome everyone formally to the Jewish Fireside Chat. This is the third in our series of weekly chats with renowned scholars from across the globe. Rabbi Yaffe, where are you joining us from?
Springfield, Massachusetts.
Springfield, Massachusetts. Amazing. Did you guys get snow? No, you didn't get snow, did you?
We got a few flurries.
Wow. Not in Atlanta.
I would doubt that, but here in May, I mean,
exactly.
The last time it snowed in May here was 1977. My older members tell me.
Nice.
So, I'll accept it on face value. But I wanted to say that you know, but usually by now I would be ensconced in my favorite place, which is right here. We have a little memorial garden here with benches, and it's not snowing anymore, and the blossoms are blooming, so it's all good. And on the way in, the one person in all of my area who doesn't have a smartphone or a computer pulls up because they have yard site. And unfortunately, of course, we're not doing minyanim.
Right.
So I say, okay, you can join us on Zoom. He says, what Zoom? I say, you have a computer? Says, no. Do you have do you have a smartphone? No, I have a flip phone. So I made up they'll call me on the landline and they'll join our Zoom in. You can't say Kaddish, but we can say, as you know, a memorial prayer, Keil Molech. So I'm saying, I was a little bit delayed that I'm the last analog person in all of Hampton County. But thank God, it's divine providence. I pulled up just in time.
I will say this, it's actually refreshing. Analog is actually a little bit refreshing. But Rabbi, before you begin, I'd like to give you a proper introduction, if I may. Rabbi Yaffe, Rabbi Shlomo Yaffe is the Dean of the Institute of American and Talmudic Law in New York, Director of the Institute of Judaic Knowledge, and a member of the editorial staff at Chabad.org. Rabbi Yaffe has lectured, led seminars, and has been a visiting scholar throughout North America, Mexico, Europe, and Africa. And he has written for various forms. He has authored many things, including some JLI courses, Living with Integrity. For those of you that joined us a few years ago for that course, Living with Integrity, that was authored by Rabbi Yaffe. Rabbi Yaffe is a tremendous scholar, proficient in both the revealed parts of Torah as well as the mystical secrets of Torah, and has the unique ability to tie together, compare and contrast U.S. law with Jewish law in a way that is crystal clear and incredibly enlightening. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome warmly Rabbi Yaffe, and welcome to our Fireside Chat. Thank you for being here with us tonight, folks. A warm welcome, please.
Well, thank you so much for an unduly generous introduction. I don't do the editorial board of Chabad.org because my duties at Congregation B'nai Torah have kept me pretty busy. This is the Orthodox synagogue in Springfield, Greater Springfield, Massachusetts. So that's where I'm rabbi, and that's the nice building with the trees and all that I'm talking to you from, and that's why I'm in Springfield. Yeah, this is our sadly underused synagogue at the moment, but that's it. Anyways, so with this topic, it's very interesting. The topic emerged because that's my email sign off. Everyone has a signature, and mine is the only bad question is the one not asked. So I first want to point out the central role that questions, even difficult questions, have in the very structure of Judaism. And then, hopefully, it's not too off what Rabbi Solish was expecting. I would like to open the floor for people's questions about Judaism that they maybe thought they shouldn't be asking. And I don't claim to have answers for everything, but we can at least begin a discussion. And actually, I should open up with the point that some questions are some situations that, as if it were engender questions, don't necessarily have answers, but they have lessons. In other words, to say X happened because of Y, so often you would have to be the Ein Sof itself, the infinite source of all, to answer that question, because that's the source of everything. Or at the very least, you'd have to be a prophet whom the Almighty communicates with. But the next level down is the ability to extract lessons from something. So by way of example, generally speaking, one of the most fascinating things and sometimes troubling thing about life is that the things that we imagine we control, we don't, and the things we imagine we don't control, we do. I mean, the classic example is that often we get into patterns, and those patterns of behavior and of life might cause us to do less of the good that we would intellectually like to do, intellectually know we'd like to do, or sometimes to fall into the habit of negative things that we want to overcome. And after a while, we convince ourselves that these are inevitable, they're fundamental character. It cannot be changed, any more than the affinity of a seal for water, or a gecko for dry land. But in truth, everything about our choices, everything about our patterns of behavior, everything that is subject to the capacity to choose to do something, even if for 50, 60, 80, 90 years you've been doing the same thing, the lesson of Passover and the counting of the Omer, which is about self-development, is that you can always leave that. In other words, all the things that we tell ourselves, or sometimes we tell our rabbi, oh, rabbi, this isn't me, I can't do it. The truth is you can, because anything subject to choice is fungible. On the other hand, we all imagine we control things like, I should have bought Apple stock when it was $4.20. It really was. And you kick yourself because, you'd have tons and tons of money if you would have done that. But the answer is yes, we can't be lazy, because 6 days a week you shall work. It's sort of a mitzvah. You got to make a vessel for God's gifts. But in the end, no one has a penny more than God wants them to have. Someone can do a wonderful swindle, but then there's lawyer fees and the cost of candy bars and the huska, right? So, in the end, we have exactly what we're meant to have. And it's not, the currency isn't always money. Sometimes it's felicity. Why do I bring this up? Because all the things we said I shoulda, coulda, woulda, with the Apple stock or whatever it is, we don't actually control those things. And the things we imagine that we can't control, our habits, our patterns, the occasions when we fly off the handle, etc., we really could control that, if we wanted to. And if we put the same effort we put into kicking ourselves for not making this investment or that investment. And with that, so if we take a look at the situation we're in, God forbid to say I know a reason. I'm not a prophet. I may be a descendant of one, because most Jews are descended from a prophet if you go back enough generations. I'm not a prophet, and I wouldn't make the claim. Generally speaking, you should know, as much as this may run counter to what you might hear from certain religious figures, anyone who says they know why something happens, God caused this to happen because, they don't know. They're wrong. And anyone who tells you they don't know, they're right. But that being said, you can learn something. There's a lesson. So I have no idea why, under any circumstance, and would strongly criticize, to say the least, anyone who says they know why this plague has come upon us. But the lesson, the understanding that we imagine that we control our lives so much, and we make all these plans, and we control nature. We have devices to control floods, and we have devices to control our health and keep all kinds of problems at bay. And we have devices to light up the night, and we have devices to answer all kinds of complicated questions, and to conquer the tyranny of space by the ability to move very quickly from place to place, and all those things. We have all these wonderful abilities to control the universe. And along comes, as creatures go, as things, a thing that isn't even living, that is tiny, that's just a bundle of RNA, which is half of the chemical that makes up your chromosomes. And this tiny little dot, the simplest possible creature, turns the whole world on its head, and we're still trying to figure out what to do about it. The lesson that so I don't say a reason, but there's a lesson in what we don't control and what we do control. We do control is, think about all the people who've reached out and tried to find ways to be connected with people, with phone calls, with Zoom, with Facebook, to leaving packages at at people who are old and alone, at their door, calling them welfare checks, and all the efforts. Think of all the educators who've all of a sudden, we talked about, I don't know, in 2200 we'll do online learning consistently, and now all of a sudden they've had to throw themselves into something that no one was prepared for. And you know what? With all the frustrations, and then I have school kids at home and all that, they've risen to the occasion and done wonderful things. And frankly, after a few days of getting all the fights out of them, it's really remarkable. And many parents tell me to see how children have settled down to help each other. And so there's a tremendous amount of good that comes out of people have time to do things that they otherwise didn't. And people are helping, supporting people whose finances were profoundly hurt by this thing. And my point is that there's a whole bunch of things we can do something about. We thought a little virus, big deal, a tiny little dot, and we can do nothing about it. But we discovered so much capacity for kindness, for generosity, for goodness, for care, for concern, to notice people who we realize are vulnerable and need to be noticed. So I don't know a reason, but I know a lesson. The question of, I don't know what the answer to the question as to why this has come upon us, but I do know that it's a unique opportunity to do good in all the realms of tzedakah, which, as we know, is, I'm sure you heard from Rabbi Solish many times, is righteousness rather than charity. It's doing what's right. And there's tzedakah with your soul, with your words, with your feelings. There's tzedakah with money. There's tzedakah with your physical body, helping someone. And there's plain old empathy. And we have so many opportunities for this that so many people have risen to. So some questions need to be answered, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe always said, not by why, by what am I supposed to do about it? And what can I learn from this? What I can learn from this is that the opportunities for good are always there, and that the idea that our agenda for how we're going to live and do good is extremely fragile, and we need to be ready to deal with entirely new realities and find a way to do good in them, and not imagine we have it all figured out and we can control everything. And again, what we think we control, we don't. And what we think we cannot control, we discover if we look within ourselves, unlimited capacity to control. So that's my thought about a lot of questions answered by what should we do, rather than why. And I want to spend a moment on the mystical here, because the essence of a question is a concealment. By definition, a question is a concealment of knowledge, right? If I ask a child from the times table, what is 5 times 6? At a certain level, the child doesn't know, and over time, the child learns. But the question is a lack of knowledge. In other words, even if it's a posed lack of knowledge, you're saying 5 as in the critique, in the beginning of the critique of pure reason, Immanuel Kant makes the point that 5 plus 7 does not actually contain the concept of 12. 5 plus 7 is 5 and 7, and the concept of 12 remains unknown. It seems like a pedantic point, but it's a very important point. There's actually a letter from the Rebbe who makes the point that some things are fundamentally unknowable, and he writes, I think the letter was originally in English, but I read it in Hebrew. Einstein and Kant, as Einstein demonstrated in physics and Kant demonstrated in philosophy. So, at any rate, a mathematical problem is a question. It includes and encompasses a lack of knowledge. Then you have the answer. But so every question, even the simplest one, is a concealment of the answer. What do you do when you put 5 and 7 together? Well, good question, and the answer is obvious. But still, at the moment, I'm asking, I have a 5 and a 7, and those are two separate things. And there is an unknown. And even more complicated questions, of course, are always an unknown. They're always a concealment. So when I ask why about something, everything flows from God. Creation is an ongoing projection, an ongoing process. It all flows from the infinite source of all, from the Ein Sof, as we like to call it in Hasidic and Kabbalistic parlance. So when the Ein Sof chooses to condense its infinite being, because it's beyond infinite or finite, into a finite knowledge, I have knowledge. That's how we know, the Torah tells us that there's such a thing as Shabbat. It tells us not to abuse people with words. The Torah tells us things that we know to be absolutely necessary and true, because God has chosen to reveal those things to us. But intellect is a tzimtzum. It is a contraction of God's infinity. It's a certain structure. All structures are limitations. All limitations are a contraction of God's infinite capacity. Therefore, what God chooses to share with us and condense into knowledge we know. By definition, anything that isn't brought down into the realm of knowledge remains concealed and we don't know. So sometimes a question gives us the ability to answer it. Sometimes a question gives us the ability to delve deeper into the Torah or into the world itself and figure out, and sometimes it remains unknown. No matter how well we understand nature, certain things remain unknown. The same thing applies about our relationship to God. So, in other words, asking why does God do something, if God didn't choose to reveal it to you, is like saying, oh, this mathematical problem, this problem in a very complex area of calculus is so profound, so difficult, even with both of my hands, I can't hold it. This is an example from the Tanya, which means to say, of course, that ideas are not grasped in the hands. They're too big for your mind, not too big for your hands. And they're not in the realm of mass and 3 dimensions. They're in another realm. So too, intellect itself cannot grasp that which God did not condense into it. So any why question about God is by definition unknowable unless God chooses to package it into the realm of intellect, because intellect is why. And very often, God does package it. And very often, God doesn't package it, but gives us the ability to reach it, which is one of the things I want to address. So when we ask the why of the problem of suffering, of illness, of disaster, even human-made disasters, and so on. In the end, sometimes we don't have an answer because it hasn't been shown to us. Certain things like the destruction of the temple, the prophets told us, but otherwise we don't know. And even the destruction of the temple has a deeper and more profound purpose than merely as a recompense, for worshiping idols and so on. There's much deeper things going on there. But at any rate, these answers and these questions are not always do we get the why, but we often get the what should we do about it. And we have to have the wisdom to know, what are we looking for? Are we looking for a lesson, or is this one of these things where we can find an answer? And with that in mind, I want to now make the point that the question, the concealment that we have to break through, and that sometimes we can, is a fundamental element of Judaism. In other words, a really good math problem advances the field of mathematics, because to answer it, you have to create entirely new ways of looking at various types of mathematics. And that's why a lot of famous math problems have remained unsolved for a period of time. The same is true of problems in physics and chemistry, even microbiology, etc. So, and the question always contains the answer, and sometimes the answer is accessible. In other words, a math problem contains the answer. It's just a matter of getting there, and sometimes you need to arrive at a whole new level of understanding and looking at the universe of numbers or whatever it is you're dealing with to grasp it. And the same applies to the Torah itself. The very Torah, the written Torah that we have, which is the basis of all of Judaism, the 5 books of Moses, is not so much a book of information. It is a book of math problems. It is a book of questions that we answer by using the system, the calculus that God gave us, which is the systems of interpreting the Torah that were handed down at the same time as the written Torah was given to Moses. They were handed down orally to be used by the scholars, to Moses to be transmitted to the scholars and the students of Torah of each generation. Ultimately, this finds itself in written form in the Mishnah and the Talmud. I'm sure you studied about that. But what I want to focus on is the Torah as a series of questions. So you all know the famous Jewish joke that someone got very upset with someone he had business dealings with. And in the middle of one of the busiest days, on one of the holidays, maybe it was Rosh Hashanah, he turns around and yells in this loud voice, the whole synagogue can hear him, "Yankel is a ganav, Yankel is a thief," yells in Yiddish. So the rabbi stops the service and says, "You can't do that. In the middle of Shul on Rosh Hashanah, everyone's here to pray and to forgive each other. How could you say such a thing? I demand that you retract and apologize." So he shrugs his shoulders and he goes up to the bima and he bangs on the bima, on the table where you read the Torah, and he says, "Rabbosai, gentlemen, Yankel is nicht kein ganav. Yankel is not a thief." In other words, the question is the inflection. And the reason I mention that is that we just read in the Torah, the very end of last week's Torah portion, about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And then it says, as you shall give to the other person, so as the other person has given, you have given the other person. You have to give that. You have to give that person. Shall be given to you. Whatever you gave to the other person shall be given to you. And the rabbis point out in the Talmud that the term netina, to give, in other words, in English, you'll say, "I'll give you a black eye," but in Hebrew that doesn't work. In Hebrew, it's a wound. In Hebrew, it's a hit. There's no, in Hebrew grammar, there's no such idea as giving someone a black eye. So the question, giving, applies to the transfer of something that's transferable. If I give you a black eye, like the old Irish folk song goes, "An eye for an eye until everyone is blind," right? You're having a black eye. I haven't given you anything. that I had. I've caused you to have an injury, but I haven't given you anything you didn't have. So the sages say that this supports what we know as part of the oral tradition. This is one of the principles, that we know by the oral tradition, that the Torah never means an eye for eye, never did mean, not for a second, an eye for an eye. It means to give compensation for the full range of compensatable things for the loss of an eye. So if someone needs both eyes for their profession, you have to pay them a very large sum for the permanent loss of their profession and for the embarrassment and shame of, walking around with an eye patch and the pain and suffering and so on and so forth. But the fact is that the word netina means to give. So from this support, this is supported. The tradition is supported by the fact that the word netina always means handing over something you have to someone else. And that wouldn't apply to inflicting an injury on someone commensurate with the injury you gave them. It merely means, of course, to give something, to give money, to give valuables in such a way that you cover the loss of the eye as much as possibly can be done. And therefore, what really the way to read the Torah is, and I mean this in all seriousness, because it's very close as where it's going. Someone injured someone. They cost them the sight of an eye, the use of a hand, a very serious injury. The Talmud calls it partial murder. So you did something really horrible. So we ask an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound. Is that what we're going to do, like Hammurabi's code and in Saudi Arabia to this day and so on? And along comes the Torah because it's a question, and a legitimate question even nowadays, and certainly in those times, it was a highly radical question. The person standing at Sinai would probably say, of course, what else do you do? And along comes the Torah and says, no, kain yinat and bo. You gain nothing but an ugly revenge by giving that person the same injury. Let that person work and pay and give back as much of the benefit of the function of the eye as he possibly can. He can't do it all, but give back as much as you can in a way that is constructive. So I can use that money to live a dignified life and pay for medical bills and so on. Be constructive. So in other words, the Torah is really asking a question. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth says, no, kain yinat and bo. It has to be something you give rather than mere childish tit for tat. And by the same token, the Torah is constantly saying things that push us back on our heel and make us ask a question. So, for example, at the very beginning of the story of creation, we have God says, Nase Adam, let us make man. And everyone asks, what do you mean? There's only one God? Is this supporting some duality, some multiple gods? So the Talmud says no, because later it says God forms in the singular. So what is let us? It says God shares it with the angels, with the spiritual beings that existed at the time. Why? To teach humanity, humility. We're created in God's image. Part of that is the capacity for abstract reasoning. With abstract, there are many other ideas, but abstract reasoning gives us the ability to control the universe in many ways, as we just discussed. So God says, hold it. No matter how bright you are and how much you think you understand everything, before you do something based on your standing, consult with someone else. You know why? Even though I created the angels and I know everything that's in their minds, I'm asking them to teach you humility and to teach you no matter how smart you are, even if you think you're as smart as God. Nevertheless, God, who you think you're as smart as, consulted with other people. So it begins with a question. Nasa Adam. God says, let us make man. This creates a question. The Torah could have written it quite simply. God said, I'm going to make man. Or just say God made man. The purpose of the question is for us to use the principles of exegesis to come to an answer. Torah is a partnership. And this is why even very difficult questions, we ask very difficult questions about the nature of God, about the Odyssey, and so on. The Torah is full of difficult questions. The Talmud, Hasidic thought, are full of the most difficult and potentially heretical questions, except that the purpose of the questions is not to throw away the Torah, but rather to embrace it. But as a partnership, God says, I'm giving you a bunch of very good questions, and if very good math problems, and if you apply yourself with the principles I gave you, you will be my partner. You will finish the process, and you will extract the answer. But it'll be your effort. Is it there in potentia? Yes. Which is why we can have a dispute. Because as long as you follow the rules, people's minds are, it's okay to come up with two different answers. We'll have to resolve it as to what to do day to day, but it's okay. God is infinite. It can bear multiple truths within the rubric, within the rubric of truth, within the range. Everything, there's ranges and limits, as we know from mathematics. So within the limits, all things are at least conceptually acceptable. So all of Judaism is really about questions. All of Judaism is a process of asking questions, sometimes very difficult ones, and either coming up with an answer where there's no system to get to an answer, with a lesson. And with that, we can look through the entire Torah and see that the Torah is specifically written in a way that raises questions and contradictions and problems. And there's by way of example, there was a wonderful scholar who passed away not long ago, Rabbi Dr. Yitzchak Breuer, who was a great Bible scholar, descended to the famous Breuer family from Germany, from Frankfurt. And he did something fascinating. He wrote a book. It's unfortunately not translated to English yet. It's called Pirkei Bereshis, Chapters on Bereshit. And what he does is he takes all the particular challenges, the textual problems and anomalies and contradictions and divergences that Bible critics have used to define the Torah as sort of a junkyard chitty chitty bang bang from different people. If anyone remembers Ian Fleming's best book, which is Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and far better than the James Bond fellow, and essentially, but rather than it being this collection of all these different disparate pieces, he demonstrates how all the questions that lead to this approach are already addressed in the Midrashim and the Talmud, and more importantly, their very purpose is to create a dissonance, to create an imbalance, to create a question. And in resolving the question, we arrive at deep truths on our own, deeper truths that are otherwise unattainable. In other words, if God were to give us everything that we derive from the Torah, there isn't a person, even Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, if he was Jewish, could not have lifted up a Torah scroll that had all information, and it would take forever to write. So rather, God gave us a series of very clever mathematical type problems, contradictions and dissonances, and in pulling them apart and finding how they fit in, the way we find how fragments of pottery and archaeology, fragments of DNA fit into a larger organism, we all of a sudden see the whole picture from those fragments. And that is infinite, which means to say these types of questions, they're almost like algorithms. A good algorithm can be used for multiple purposes. And the same with the questions in the Torah. So all of the Torah is what we call shakla v'tarya, question and answer. The Talmud is written this way, but the very Torah itself is a series of questions. Should we never be afraid to ask a question? There are the most fundamental questions. How is God present in this world if he's truly infinite? These Hasidic press the question, why is there a world at all? How is it possible for infinite being to have knowledge of finite experiences, and on and on? There are wonderful answers to all these questions. But if we didn't ask them, we wouldn't understand all the things that God has projected himself into reality, and where we are able to understand. But basically, with the full extent of our ability, which means to say that the Ein Sof challenges us to stretch and reach the utmost of our ability. Then once we hook onto that, we're attached to a conveyor of infinite power. It's sort of like, once you can get out of the Earth's gravity, you can use the very gravity of the whole solar system to slingshot you at far greater speeds than you could ever do with the puny chemicals that we're able to put together, since we haven't figured out a warp drive yet. So the same thing is, once we by our questions and our answers, we attach ourselves to God's wisdom. So then we are now being carried along by the velocity of the Ein Sof, of the infinite itself. But to get onto that spaceship, to make the jump onto that conveyor, we need to ask questions honestly, not to be afraid of any question, but to also accept that there always is an answer or a lesson. There's always any question you can think of. There always is something there. And the humility and religiosity is simply the process of accepting that it's there and looking for it and looking for it and looking for it. Like the difference between an optimist and a pessimist, the little boy is a pessimist. You put him in a room full of all the best toys and he starts crying because he's worried about one of them is going to break. And the pessimist, you put him in a room full of, the optimist, you put him in a room full of horse dung and he's digging away happily with his plastic shovel. And someone comes by and says, you have a room full of dung. What are you looking for? He says, with all this horse dung, there has to be a pony in here somewhere for me. And that's the attitude that one needs to take with regards to questions. So that is some thoughts on questions. And now I'd like to take a few minutes. We have about, I think, 18 minutes left of the session. If anyone has some of those types of questions that they'd like to explore, I don't claim I'll have an answer, but I can give a shot at it.
So folks, please take the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask questions. You have, this is a beautiful, beautiful opportunity and a rare opportunity to ask a scholar on Rabbi Yaffe's caliber about these questions. So ask anything that's on your mind, on your heart.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Some years ago, I heard Rabbi Blech speak at a retreat I was at, Discovery Weekend, whatever. But long story short, he talked about, he posed this. He said, if God is omnipotent, if he's all powerful, if he's omnipresent, he's everywhere, he's omniscient, he's all knowing, and we believe he's good, how could bad things happen? And the crux of his answer was, he allows man to have free choice. And that is not what I've heard the Chabad take to be, but I'd like to know how you answer that.
Okay, so this deserves a whole discussion of its own. But can you hear me? Okay.
Barely, yeah.
It's very strange because I'm having the same problem, and I have the volume up really high. So if I speak, can you hear me better now? If I speak louder?
You're fine.
I'll just speak louder.
Okay,
So here's the deal. I mean, based on my understanding of the way Lubavitcher Rebbe looks at this, the way Kabbalah and Hasidut as a whole look at it. And not only are some questions difficult, some answers, or in this case, explanations, are very challenging. But nevertheless, if we're honest about this, man's free will, and this is something, it's in chapter 25 of the 4th section of Tanya, and there are many beautiful glosses from the Rebbe on this. So basically, your free will means your choice to do evil. In other words, let us say, I'm going to give a grossly simplified scenario. So please forgive me for the gross oversimplification, but it's a good way to start. For reasons known only to God, right? Because we already established that all the problems of the Odyssey, of God being good and suffering and so on, in the end, because God chooses to hide himself from us, all sorrow and trouble is described as God hiding himself. Ani hastir, I shall hide myself on that day. It's all God hiding. If God hides, again, knowledge is revelation. Where God hides the revelation, it's fundamentally unknowable, the same way you cannot hold an idea in your hand as too heavy or too light or too soft or too mushy. Ideas aren't heavy, light, soft, or mushy. And our mind can only hold what God chooses to reveal. So that's the first point. In other words, the question of why would something that we experience as bad and is genuinely bad in our world come from a fundamentally good God? The answer is it's a very good question, but it's a question that is intellect, and anything where God hides his goodness, it's a concealment from all the realms, all the Sephirot, all the realms of human experience, including intellect. That's step one. Step two is that our choice is to do evil. So let us say you're walking down the street, and for reasons known to God alone that I claim not to have any understanding of why, God decides that I need to get a bump on my head. So either, depending on where you are, either, an eagle could drop a coconut on my head, or someone is tempted by their evil inclination to chuck a rock at me. If the individual controls their evil inclination, they pass the test, and the eagle, which is controlled by God, drops the coconut. Otherwise, if I get the rock on my head, that person is responsible. A roa b'chira. So they chose evil, but the bump I get only because God wants me to have the bump. So how many times has someone tried to murder someone and failed? Not because of their effort or their preparation or their equipment, because in the end, this person's life was not meant to end at that moment. So we have free will, and God basically organizes in an incredibly complex, multi-threaded way with an infinity of threads that the person who has to have free will, whether to throw a rock at another human being or not, and the person needs a bump on their head, come together. If that person chooses the right thing, other scenarios kick in. Because every choice we make, like any time an object passes through any part of the universe, its gravitational pull makes fundamental changes in the fabric of space-time. Every choice we make causes different threads to come into play. It's like a chess game where there's a finite but very large number of possible plays, and every move you make closes certain paths to a checkmate and opens other paths. But they're all there from the beginning, and we choose which path we take to fulfill the ultimate purpose of our creation. So, for example, we can make lots of bad choices, but inevitably, it says in Shmuel that God constantly figures out ways that we never be driven away. However many trips back here, reincarnations, and various interesting experiences in the realm of souls it takes, sooner or later we'll get it right, statistically, but by our free will. And if we understand all those things, so the fact is everything flows from the Ein Sof. It can't be otherwise. God is everywhere. And our free will doesn't change. Our free will is a quality God gives us, but doesn't change the fact that everything flows from God. No human being has any power over another human being. Now, in the realm of justice, we treat it that way. A murderer or war criminal should be punished because the person made a bad choice. There's a very interesting series of lectures by Oliver Wendell Holmes on the common law, where he makes the point that in the English-speaking countries, we never assume anyone's action, anyone's intention, except by the action that a reasonable person would assume the intention comes from there, that it's expressing that intention. So the same thing, how do you know someone intended to murder someone? Because they did. How do you know intended to steal? Because they did. If they only tried and failed and no one knows about it but God, that's between them and God. But that being said, God judges us on our choices. Human beings can judge each other in a justice system on choices that are obvious by virtue of the outcome. But your choice does not create the outcome. The Ein Sof creates the outcome. And why in other words, free will doesn't answer the problem of a volcano. It doesn't answer the tsunami. Look at all the wonderful, nice little kids, who never passed away in the tsunami. That in 2005, diseases happen all the time. There are a lot of very sad, unfortunate things that have nothing to do with free will. So respectfully, I would follow this idea in the 25th chapter of Tanya that God is everywhere and is the Ein Sof, is the stuff of everything. And everything that happens flows from the Ein Sof. That being said, part of that quality of that providence is free will. Free will is the other half of the image of God. God gives us free will. It's not an absence of control. It's a profound form of control in that God gives us free will, which the only other being that has free will is God. God could create a universe or not create a universe. So we have free will, but that doesn't change outcomes. That changes our choice as to what we're going to do with our lives and the ultimate disposition of our souls and how many incarnations it takes and so on. But just like we don't control who gets sick from a microbe or a virus, we don't control who is harmed by our evil actions. But if it can be proved you did an evil action, human beings must eradicate evildoers or punish them severely, because that's justice. And the same applies for how God judges a person throughout their lives and at the end of their lives. But there is nothing, no power human being has over another, and that creates very difficult questions. But if you accept omniscience and omnipotence, that God stands above time and above space, you accept that creation is a projection happening every moment, there's no other way of looking at it. So
Yeah, I
it's
think
deeper.
what you're saying, sorry for cutting in. I think what you're saying is very, very important, because you're saying that all the outcomes are coming from God. We make choices that open up or close various pathways, but the outcome is going to happen. All of that strengthens the question, then, how can a good God?
Right. So the answer to that is what we began with. The answer of how, the question how and why, is an intellectual question that only works where God chooses, the Eight Self chooses to express its infinite self, to condense it into intellect, into the realm of intellect. Again, you can't hold an idea in your hand, and the intellect cannot grasp the essence of God. So everything is hidden unless it's revealed. And that which remains hidden, and you know what? I'll be honest with you. The Lubavitch Rebbe gave a very difficult, a very hard to absorb or hard to accept parable that nevertheless really works if we're open-minded. So I'm hoping we have an open-minded crowd here. Now, let us say that now we try to avoid contact and so on. But let us say when contact wasn't avoided, you come across someone in a not just a pre-industrial, but a pre-agricultural situation. They're still only using stone tools. They don't need to count to more than 5. They're very intelligent, but a pre-contact Amazonian tribe, let us say, and you bring that person as they are. That day, you fly them to New York. And you want to show them something really interesting, so you take them to an operating theater in a hospital. Now, again, I have to say that the point of this parable, because people have gotten upset in the past, the point of the parable is not that I can tell you that there's some kind of constructive purpose to human suffering. That would be a reason. No one knows reasons for God. But the point of the parable is a certain sliver of it. So you take someone to an operating theater and you see them strap a person down. Remember, this guy doesn't know about anesthesia, or gal, whatever he or she is, doesn't know about anesthesia, doesn't, know about surgery, doesn't know about any of these things. And you see them cut a person open entirely, the entire chest is cracked open and the heart is removed. So what does the person think? What are you doing to this guy? You're a bunch of murders. We all know you take someone's heart out, they're dead. You say, no, actually, we're going to fix the heart and put it back in. Where this person is holding, there's no way they could ever comprehend this. And this is a human being who's as intelligent as you, who has the same genetic makeup as you. He's just a few hundred years technologically behind. And this person will go back to the Amazonia and tell all his friends or her friends that in New York, they rip people's hearts out for no apparent reason. And they kill people that way. And thank God we're not among these horrible people. And the Rebbe's point was that even two human beings separated by a few years of technology, it's possible there's no way this person could ever understand that this is anything but a horrific ritual murder of some sort. You know, with the coats and the gowns and the whole paraphernalia. All these people around. But it's not what it is at all. And so the Rebbe's point was that it's entirely possible to conceive of a human being completely not grasping something, even if it's between human beings. All the more so when you're dealing with the most brilliant human being is finite, and God is infinite. And there are multiple infinities. Not only is God infinite, there's an infinity of infinities. To take a page from George Cantor's mathematics, there's an infinity of infinities between us and God. So unless God chooses to condense what he does into, and I use he because the neutral in Hebrew is he, by the way. There's only a male and a female, but the male serves also as the neutral. God is sometimes described as male in the Torah, in Tanakh, but in several places Tanakh also is female. Anyways, but the point is that what God is doing, unless God chooses to condense it into the realm of intellect, we don't understand. Sometimes we can find a lesson from it, or what should we do about it? So you look at the most horrible things that happen. Yeah, so it's an unanswerable question because God is hiding from us. And this is what in the 11th chapter of Igeret HaKodesh, the Reb Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad, basically says, this is one of the things we're created for. To have the ability to accept our limits and the fundamental goodness of God, though it's hidden and not at all visible. But it's very reasonable and logical to understand that there are things completely beyond the grasp of the intellect because it is a finite created reality. But it's hard emotionally to do so. And it's that emotional struggle that is one of the most important things we need to do to get through life and maintain a positive relationship with God.
I think
there is a relationship.
That's brilliant. I want to get to Julie has a question. Julie, please unmute yourself and ask Rabbi Yaffe. We have just a few minutes left.
And then also I think Edela has a question too. So 1 second. So who's asking the questions? I don't hear anyone.
Here. Julie is unmuted, but we can't hear you. Julie, go ahead.
Oy. Zoom is not always perfect. What should I tell you?
Julie, if you want, you can text me the question and I can ask it. If that
wait, she is unmuted. Julie A?
Julie A, yeah.
Unmuted, but I can't hear a thing. So text it. And so let's move on to Adele, and we'll come back and see if you can find the question.
Okay, Adele, go ahead.
She needs to unmute herself.
Adele, I just unmuted you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Okay. In reading Emor, it talks about the purpose of the Exodus is that Israel sanctify my name, and that Kiddush Hashem is fulfilled in the best possible manner by victims of evil.
So what is the source of that?
I was just reading in Emor, it said, let's see, Emor, it was verse 33. The purpose of the Exodus is that Israel sanctify my name. And then one of the footnotes said that Kiddush Hashem is fulfilled in the best possible manner by victims of evil. And is that an answer?
I don't think it's an answer. Kiddush Hashem in this context means that people are willing to basically say that no human being has power over me. I'm going to do what I need to do, what God asks of me, what I need to do as what God asks of me as a person, as a Jew, and so on. And look, God has the power over my life and death. I'm not bending, like Hannah and her 7 sons, like the 10 martyrs. I'm not bending. You want to, the victims of the Crusades, you want to kill me, understand I only die if God wants me to die. And at any rate, you have no power over me, because even if my whole life is condensed into this one moment of heroism, this one moment of saying, no one has power over me but God, and I will not worship idols, etc. I will not convert. So that Kiddush Hashem, that sanctification of God's name, means to say this awareness that no one has power over you but God. God may choose to end your life. God may not. But no one can force you to do anything other than what God asked you. There is no power and furthermore, it doesn't even extinguish you because life doesn't begin at birth or end at death. There's a very famous story that expresses this idea that you're talking about. When the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, was arrested by the precursor to the NKVD, which was the precursor to the KGB, by the GPU. So they demanded that he give up details of he had a very extensive underground network teaching and facilitating Judaism throughout the Soviet Union. And they wanted him to give up his network, and he refused to answer any of their questions or admit to guilt and so on. So finally, his interrogator, who unfortunately was also a Jew, got very frustrated and grabbed a revolver off the table, put it to the Rebbe's head, and said, this little toy has made far bigger and stronger people than you change their minds. And and this idea that you can break even the most sophisticated and profoundly intellectual person with a little bit of physical violence, that's really one of the great themes in Koestler's Darkness at Noon. I'm not in general an Arthur Koestler fan, but it's a good book. So he expects the previous Rebbe to bow to the threat of death. And the Frierdiker Rebbe looks calmly at him and says, "This little toy frightens those who worship many gods, but only have one world. I worship one God and have multiple worlds. I'm not afraid." And this is the idea of Kiddush Hashem. And yes, sometimes in our eyes, that means that people gave their lives. But a person can accomplish more in one instant than of a very concentrated connection to God than maybe someone else does with 100 years of mitzvot and so on. And again, I don't claim to know why this is, or why it has to be this way, or why it can't be another way. Those are answers I don't know. Those are answers that would be arrogant. But the how and the what is that Kiddush Hashem means that we have the capacity to declare that the only reality is God, and no human being or force of nature has power over us. Because even if this is the end, A, that end comes from God, and B, it's not the end. It's another stage.
Oh.
Yeah, and I think your point is that that's not the reason why it's happening, why this threat is happening. That's a response that we have to the situation. But far be it from us to know why God orchestrated in such a way.
No, and there's no explanation, because conceivably you can argue God could do it another way. So the answer is, it's why it's trying to hold a problem of the integral calculus in 3 fingers exactly. You don't hold calculus in your fingers, you hold it in your mind. You don't hold God in your mind, you hold God. And by the way, the Zohar says that God is not graspable in the intellect. No thought can grasp God, but the desire of our heart, the commitment to do what's right no matter what, that can grasp God, whether it's a lifetime of it or a moment of it.
Okay, excellent. If we can just get to Julie, I know Julie had a question, and then we'll close it out. Julie, are you there? One second. Let's see. Julie, are you there? Julie.
Okay, could you hear me now?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, I'm having a problem with the mic on my computer, and I didn't want to restart, but thank you. And Rabbi, I'm enjoying.
You're going to see my ear. I'm trying to listen. It's slow.
It's beautiful. It's a very lovely ear. I'm appreciating the depth of your talk, and you may have already answered this. I'm not quite sure there's an answer, but it relates more to Jewish law, perhaps. I understand that there are things that are not revealed to us, and therefore challenges to understanding. And sometimes we need to experience to understand. And I could relate to that through, for example, my parents passing, saying Kaddish, the rules of mourning in Jewish law. experiencing that led me to a very deep appreciation of Jewish law and why we do things. My question relates to ideas that require pure faith that don't seem to mesh at all with experience. You know, one example would be related to a woman giving birth, and how that represents, and I'm probably bastardizing this, but represents a death of sorts and is connected to women's impurity. So ideas that require pure faith, that don't mesh with experience, lead to me, especially when I don't get an answer that seems satisfying, to start questioning the foundation of Jewish law and the extent to which it's man-made. So I just would love your response to that, or your thoughts about that.
Okay, so before I address the particular issue, yes, in the end, something that comes from God, by definition, comes from a place beyond our understanding, yet there's also this partnership we spoke about. So the fact that a law doesn't necessarily make sense to us where we are right now and so on doesn't negate the value of that law. Because even on the most basic level, before we get to the idea of God being beyond the intellect, the idea that, you know, that God is smarter than us, as if it were, you don't even need a lot of faith for that. The idea that God knows and understands things that we don't. I mean, look, we need a GPS to make it through a highway cloverleaf, and God created a little butterfly with a brain, smaller than a fingernail paring, smaller than a poppy seed, and it can navigate 7,000 miles perfectly. So God knows a lot of stuff that we don't. I mean, it's on a very basic level. That being said, there's no question. The only bad question, the one not asked, is sometimes we have to dig deeper. So the example you brought, I think, is a very good one, in the sense that, yes, ritual purity and impurity by definition, though that's a bad translation, as you'll see in a moment, they're a chok, they're a law which doesn't have a essential intellectual demand. Don't murder, don't steal. Those have a fundamental intellectual demand. Every society needs some system of policing those things. Ritual purity and impurity don't. Now, next step. The tuma does not actually mean impure. Tuma means occluded. The word tameh means to say something that is stopped up, occluded. It is opaque. Tahara, purity, as we see earlier in the Torah, ke'etzem hashamayim l'Torah, like the very structure of the heavens for clarity, it means transparency. Tameh is something where, and it doesn't have to be your fault, where divine life force is occluded and is not flowing. And tahor, which is transparency, is where the divine life force is flowing. It's transparent to the divine life force. And the definition of tahara is where the life force is flowing properly. The definition of tumah is where the life force that should be there or was there isn't there. It is now opaque. It is now occluded. It is now like an artery filled with plaque that the blood cannot flow through. It's an occlusion. So, for example, even when certain animals die, there was a lot of vitality there, and now it's missing. There's this delta between what was and what is, and that occlusion, that withdrawal of life force, that darkening, when we come into contact with it, it creates a distance from divinity. It creates a different distance from divine life force. Now, it's the same, by the way, with the monthly cycle, but when a woman is pregnant, there is another life and another soul within her. There is another life within her. I mean, I think a lot of people, even with all the difficulties, there's a great simcha in having the child, but there's something special, which I have no experience in, but I know lots of people who do, in carrying the child. But certainly, Kabbalistically speaking, there's another soul intertwined with one's own. In other words, it's not just another soul within you. There's two souls become one. The idea of Ibor exists in men also, according to the Ari, according to the book on the gates of reincarnation, a very important Kabbalistic work, that sometimes we carry another soul within us and don't even know it. And the point being, though, that's true of regular pregnancy. that there is another life that is completely melded and absorbed in one's own. When that life leaves to become its own life, there is a reduction in the intensity of divine energy. There's less soul, there's less energy in the person. And that creates maybe not an emotional, sometimes also, but that creates a occlusion. There's less light where there was more. And anytime there's less life, less divine life where there was more, that is tuma. And now that the child has gone off to be a person on their own, that soul is no longer within the mother. So the basic premise that all tuma is a product of a lessening of divine life force, once you accept that first premise, which we receive, so then the relationship of tuma, not impurity, but an absence of life where there was once life, is true when a woman gives birth. That's the basic explanation. So, and again, the law stands on its own, but the concept is commensurate with the concept of tuma and its relation to life force throughout the whole Torah and all the types of tuma, whether it's contact with a dead body or a dead cow, and so on and so forth.
So the 3 weeks for a girl versus 2 weeks for a boy, I don't remember the whole. So that seems arbitrary.
No, it works perfectly. It's 7 and 14, and then the days. It's double. It works perfectly because who has the capacity to create life? In other words, we know that the halachic definition of a Jew is someone with a Jewish mother. The soul primarily flows through the mother. The father helps a little bit. He gives the tribe. Because let's be honest, in terms of the creation of a child, 99.9% of the work is done by the mother. The father does very little. That's the reality, and it's therefore true spiritually too. So a woman has more capacity for life, to create life, and therefore when a woman leaves a person's womb, there's a much bigger loss, there's a much bigger delta than when a boy leaves, a little bit of life leaves, a girl leaves, a lot more life leaves, because the woman is the one who has the capacity to actually bring divine life, the divine soul, into this world. So again, once you accept the first premise, it's not arbitrary, it matches perfectly. Because double in the Torah, doubling is always more than doubling. It's saying it's a different dimension. It's like, like the Richter scale of earthquakes. It's exponential. So the doubling of the time, both for purity and impurity, tuma and tara, by a girl has to do with the fact that it's exponentially a different level of life. A girl is a different level of life than a boy. I may not like that, but that's the reality that I have to accept humbly.
Okay.
There's a lot more about this, but once
I know, and I would go further, but I know there's.
No, I'm just saying, but you pick it up with Rabbi or Mrs. Solish, there's many important mystical ideas in this very brief and really inadequate treatment. But if you follow the thread, I think you'll find many interesting things.
Thank you. I appreciate your response.
All right, Rabbi, I want to be respectful of your time. Julie, thank you for asking. Thank you, Adina Malka, for asking. Thank you, Mark, for asking questions. Like the premise of tonight's talk, there is no such thing as a bad question. Questions exist. And these, as Rabbi Yaffe said before, and I'm not going to say it as eloquently as he did, but there are these, gaps or these wrinkles in text and in logic that open up new arenas of insight. So it's all about probing those areas and analyzing and exploring and never being satisfied with level one answer, but always looking deeper because there's always something more to learn. I know that I can speak for myself. I've learned a lot tonight, and I'm sure all of you have learned a lot tonight. Rabbi, thank you very much for joining us, and it's a real treat to have you with us here tonight.
Everyone, please stay well, and hopefully we'll get through this and acquire a few more mitzvot on the way.
Take care.
Okay.
All the best.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi. And
Thank you.
folks, before you all leave, I just want to share one thing in the context of questions. So next Sunday, we're not confirmed yet 100%, but next Sunday, for those of you that are familiar with the new Netflix series called, or the relatively new Netflix series called Unorthodox, if you've heard of it, raise your hand. Unorthodox. Yeah, it's a very interesting documentary, and it portrays Hasidic life and love and marriage in a very interesting way. So next week, along the themes of asking questions and asking difficult questions, we're going to be having a forum, a Q&A forum discussion. We're just now confirming details, but please God, it'll be next week, pretty much the same time, 7 or maybe 7:30, but pretty much around this time, with a guest speaker who will be addressing Unorthodox, the documentary, but also the Hasidic take on love, marriage, relationships, perspective on the world, insular versus out there, all sorts of questions we're going to be addressing next week. It's all about asking all the questions, asking the really hard questions, and we may not have all of the answers, but we're gonna keep on trying. Adina Malka's asked me, how can you view Unorthodox? You need a Netflix account, and I'm not necessarily advocating that you watch it. If you watch it or you didn't watch it, I think either way, you're going to gain a lot from next week's program. It's going to be incredibly, incredibly insightful. I loved what Rabbi, personally, again, I'm just speaking for myself here. I loved what Rabbi Yaffe said. I love how he articulated these ideas. I think that the point is, whether we'll always get the full answers, who knows? But whether we'll ask the question and go deeper, that we can certainly work on. Sandrine just texted me saying that, Adina Malka, you can always get the book. The book is the book called Unorthodox also? Yes? Is that the book? Thumbs up? Yeah? Okay. Yes. I think the book is also called Unorthodox. There's a 4-part series on Netflix called Unorthodox. Again, I'm not advocating you watch it. I'm just addressing the concept of love, marriage, relationships from a Jewish, but specifically a Hasidic viewpoint, which should be fascinating. We have somebody who is well-versed in the topic, and she will be, again, I'm not putting out names yet until we are 100% locked in. Stay tuned. Tomorrow, the information should go out. Stay tuned. She is an incredible speaker, anonymous so far, as of right now. But join us next week. Same bat time, same bat channel-ish, unless it changes, maybe 7:30, but it should be, I believe it's going to be 7. Okay, join me this week for all sorts of fun, exciting programs and learning and exploring. And thank you. Have a good night. Laila Tov. Shavua Tov. See you.
Thank you.
Pleasure,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. Take
Good
care.
night. Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye. Pleasure.